Hi, I'm Charlie Thompson, and welcome to the Chapter 14 Terrestrial Biomes and also Soils lecture. This is the last chapter for the semester. This is also the chapter that kind of ties everything together from the very first days of physical geography when I told you the most important factor in 95% of everything is latitude. And if it's not latitude, it's plate tectonics, which causes things like mountains and continents. So really everything we've been studying all semester is going to get wrapped up in different biomes, which are groups of plants and animals that are the result of the climate where they live. For example, these are baobab trees in Madagascar, very typical scene. Baobabs are amazing. They live, I want to say, thousands of years, many, many hundreds of years, and they also store an enormous amount of water in their trunk. So you can see it doesn't look like it's been raining. It may not have rained for months, right? When the ITCZ shifts away from you, it can be gone for 6 months. So they've got to store enough water to live, to keep growing until the ITCZ comes back. So this is an enormous chapter. We talk about biogeography, soils, different types of soils, tropical soils, grassland soils, forest soils, young soils, volcanic soils, and then we talk about biomes, these 10 or so groupings of plants and animals. So what are we going to talk about? How are Earth's biomes organized? Well, the answer is just like climate, based on temperature and rainfall. That's pretty much it. What are geographic tools for conservation? That's an easy one. That's, island biogeography. I was going to say biogeography, but island biogeography, or conservation island biogeography. How are soils classified? Well, that's interesting. I was going to say, well, it's based on... Well, yeah, so it's a combination of what made them and what they are. So I'd say soils are classified based on how they're made and what they are. And what are the spatial patterns of Earth's biomes and soils? Just like the spatial pattern of Earth's climates, deserts, polar regions, rainforests, Mediterranean areas, all that is going to be coming back. And now we're going to call them biomes. And different kinds of soil, although the biomes are going to be way more important than the soils. So biogeographic realms are different than biomes, and biomes are made up of ecosystems to try to keep all this stuff. Like every now and then I'm all, oh yeah, how would you, if I was a student, what would confuse me? Probably like, what's the difference between an ecosystem and a biome? And I would say, well, biomes are made up of ecosystems. An ecosystem is a group of plants and animals and the non-living stuff that makes up their environment, their habitat. And biomes are larger than ecosystems. Like an ecosystem, you could look at a city park as an ecosystem, but we would look at like the Mediterranean regions of California and consider that one biome. So biogeographic realms are based on evolutionary relationships. So these are groups of plants and animals that have all evolved together. So we've got the Nearctic, the Neotropical, the Afrotropical, the Palearctic, the Indo-Malay, and the Australasian. So some of them make sense, or maybe they don't. Like the Indo-Malay seems kind of arbitrary, but right here are the Himalayas. So that's going to be a huge barrier to dispersal from everything down here to everything up here. Going back and forth is going to be very difficult because of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayan mountains. Same thing down here between the Australasian Indo-Malay. Wallace's line is a line on the map, and it overlays a deeper area of the ocean. And it was actually a physical barrier to migration between organisms from Australia moving towards Asia, as well as organisms from Asia trying to go to Australia. So in this region of the world, the Australasian, the animals and the plants evolved together, and they evolved separately from the Indo-Malay. Same thing with the Neotropical and the Nearctic. I would imagine, oh yeah, it's going to be desert. So yeah, if you're going from here, you'd be going from grasslands, and now you're in tropical rainforest. Now we're still in the tropics, still in the but really wet tropics, and then you've got a barrier of desert. So anything that's going to do fine in the wet tropics is going to get stopped cold by the desert. So the climate would act as a barrier to organisms moving north and south. I think one of the only ones to make it was the opossum. The only marsupial in North America, the only successful, I'm going north, baby, is the opossum. Opossum virginianus, I think is its name. So the biogeographic realms are based on evolutionary relationships in the way past. Biomes are large, stable ecosystems classified according to the main vegetation type. So you can kind of look at them and know, oh, it's a forest, it's a desert, it's Mediterranean. Because these different biomes have different adaptations to the different climates. The climates drive the biomes. There's terrestrial and aquatic. We're not going to talk about those. We're just going to talk about the terrestrial biomes. We're just going to talk about terrestrial. We're not going to talk about the aquatic, marine, or freshwater biomes outside the scope. They're wet. That's good enough. Biomes are defined by native species. Here we've got little bits of relic biome with anthropogenic human-caused biome here in Norway. When we're talking about plants kind of get lumped into 6 major groups. Forests, trees. Savanna, grass and trees. Shrubland, no trees, shrubs. Grassland, grass. Desert, cactusy things, succulents, maybe some grass, maybe some annual flowers. And tundra, which is in places where it's really, really cold, so no trees because it's too cold. Maybe some dwarf willows. Say that one 3 times fast after thinking about tree. Dwarf willow trees, really common in Alaska. In the tundra, mosses, lots of moss, lots of lichen, very low, flat things in the tundra. So just looking at the shapes of the plants, you can see already the shapes of the plants, like the difference between tundra and grassland and forest. It's all based on climate. Tundra based on temperature, desert based on rainfall, grassland, shrubland, savanna, forest based on the interplay of temperature and rainfall. So the tropics. Tropics are obvious. The huge leaves. I mean, this is a crazy example. And so is this. But all plants have adapted their leaves to the climate that they're in to take advantage of the climate that they are in, or at least not get hammered by the climate that they're in. I put a whole bunch of pictures. So this is plant adaptations to heat and drought. Narrow leaves so that they don't get too much sunlight. Leaves with coatings to prevent water loss. Deep roots. Burls to store water and energy. A really common fire adaptation as well, having a big massive root ball that stores energy. Self-pruning to drop leaves or branches that you don't need. Hard, waxy leaves. Very common chaparral. Buckbrush, scrub oak, toyon. They have these really waxy coatings that help them preserve water and also help them burn for nutrient cycling. And I stole these from underwoodillustration.com. Desert plants, again, we've got light colors also. Needle leaves are not broad shapes, right? Because water loss is a big problem. Juniper, little scale-like pine leaves. Ocotillo, brittlebrush. All these plants have adaptations. Creosote bush. There is a stand of creosote bush in California that they think is 14,000 years old. It's been reproducing by cloning, so that creosote bush has been living in the same spot for the last 14,000 years, but it hasn't always been the same creosote bush that's been alive. It's just connected, and it just keeps growing. More desert plant adaptations. I would say read these on your own. They're really totally interesting, talking about why cactuses look the way they do. This is on weather and fire patterns in especially chaparral in California. So we've got Santa Ana setting up here. Elements of desert landscape history. The idea that the rain shadow, you can't have a rain shadow without mountains. So back before the Sierras existed, Nevada would have been wetter. I was going to say there was one. Where did it go? Oh, yeah, there it is. Desert plants, ocotillo. Ocotillos lose their leaves in the dry period. So after it rains, they look like dead sticks. After it rains, they get leaves out of nowhere. And then when it goes dry, they drop those leaves again. Ocotillo, amazing plants. Desert high Sierra, at high elevation, there's adaptations. The plants often grow really low to the ground to try to pick up as much heat from the ground as possible. They're often covered with tiny hairs, again, to preserve heat at night. They have a very short growing season. Often the time between the snow melting in the summer and the snow falling in the winter could be 2 months. So they have to go from seed to a plant to making flowers, to getting pollinated, to making seeds and dying in the space of a couple months. And the soils are crappy because it's all this bare rock caused by physical weathering. And the short growing season means that nobody gets to develop a lot of organic material to die to act as nutrients in the soil. So it's a catch-22 that places that don't have good soils, it's hard to make good soils. Vegetation types, biomes. So we've got these 6 different basic vegetation types. We can break it down into 10 to 16 different biomes. If you go to the Wikipedia page on biomes, it gets incredibly confusing because they talk about all these different systems that these different researchers have come up with. The book, we just use 10 biomes, although they break a couple of those, like the mid-latitude grasslands are broken into tall and short. Don't let it completely overwhelm you. The final exam is open book. The most important things that I want you to keep in mind are the relationship between the biome and the climate. And maybe not the actual name of the climate, but what the general characteristics of that climate are. So like like a DFA or a DFC or whatever, not as important as, it's getting well below freezing here in the wintertime. That's the level of climate awareness that I'm hoping for from you. Temperature and precip play a large role. In fact, the largest role is temperature and precip. So here we've got biogeographic divisions broken down across 2 axes. We've got dry to wet, and then we've got cold to hot. So here we've got hot and dry, warm desert, cold and dry, Arctic tundra, hot and wet, tropical rainforest. And over here at cold and wet, there is nothing cold and wet because the colder it gets, the less water vapor you can have. So you can't have a cold, wet climate. You can have cold and kind of wet, in which case it's a temperate rainforest, like up in Washington State. As we get, hot and dry, cold and dry. The hot and drier or wetter than desert, savanna in North America and across Europe, mid-latitude grassland, drier, like there's no trees. It's too dry for trees. Here, they might get the same amount of rain because it is colder. Because it's colder here, the potet is going to be lower, so you'd actually get more effective rainfall in a colder climate. Broadleaf mixed forest, we'll talk about that. That's the vegetation of much of the East Coast with deciduous trees and pine trees growing together. And here is, I stole this. This is off of Wikipedia, off the biomes, talking about, again, same deal, temperature across the bottom and then increasing precipitation values, going from tropical rainforest, hot and wet, subtropical desert, hot and dry, cold and dry tundra, and everything in between. Grassland, Mediterranean would be in here someplace, woodland, shrubland, temperate seasonal, temperate rainforest, boreal forest, pine forest, snowy forest. Conservation biogeography. So biogeography is the study of the distribution of plants and animals. Where do they live? Why do they live there? Conservation biogeography is using the ideas of biogeography for conservation. Invasive species are non-natives. I think we talked about those in the last chapter. They have to be non-natives that take over. The reason that they can do that, and part of the problem, there's 2 problems with invasive species, and it kind of centers around the fact that because they're strangers, nobody eats them. So because they show up and there isn't necessarily a predator, their population explodes. And because there isn't a predator, their population explodes, but nobody can eat them or nobody wants to eat them. So they just keep reproducing and nobody's eating them. But as they reproduce, they're taking over the niche occupied by native species that somebody else was eating. So, oh man. So a native plant moves in, or rather an invasive plant moves in, outcompetes the native plant because nothing eats this new invasive plant. As it takes over the habitat of the native plant, whatever used to eat the native plant is now also going to go extinct because they don't eat the new invasive plant. So they take over habitat and they make native species go extinct by either taking over their habitat or because the native species, whatever they replaced, they're no good for the existing native species that used the old plant for habitat or for food or for whatever it was. There's often a very intimate relationship between the plants and the animals in a region. For example, there's some yuccas that are pollinated by one particular species of moth. If the yucca goes extinct, the moth goes extinct. If the moth goes extinct, the yucca goes extinct. So invasive species, something that conservation biogeographers would study. Zebra mussels, kudzu, plants along the Colorado River, purple loosestrife. I mean, that looks gorgeous, but it's also a monocrop, right? So there's no diversity here anymore. There probably could have been, a dozen different plants growing here, and now it's all purple loosestrife. And whatever used to eat or live in those existing plants can't do it now. Here we've got tamarisk, Russian olive, taking over, occupying spaces that used to be occupied by the native cottonwoods because they can outcompete. So island biogeography is, let me back that up. Island biogeography is an idea that came about in the 1960s. Jared Diamond and James Brown were some of the main researchers. Geographers started using computers because scientists started using computers. So that was really exciting. And all the cool geographers wanted to use computers to do research. And so they were looking at things that they could make into numbers and then study the numbers. And one of them, turns out, works really well is biodiversity, the number of different species in a region. So it turns out there's a relationship between the size of habitat and the number of different species. And this realization came about in the 1960s. And it's the topic, the idea is called island biogeography. So island organisms develop in isolation. They're often unique, like on Hawaii. New organisms quickly replace natives. Taught us about habitat fragmentation. I'll talk about that in just a second. Disconnected habitats leads to problems. Yes, habitat fragmentation. So yeah, I think that's an iwi. I think it's a honey creeper. It's a native bird in Hawaii. That's just way too many words. It's not too many words for you to read. It's too many words for me to even think about talking about. So I'm just going to look at this diagram. So this is the idea of equilibrium in island biogeography. So we have these two axes. We have the rate of immigration. So the premise of the study of island biogeography, the way this would work is they would look at the size of islands and look at the number of different species on those islands. And some of the ideas that went into thinking that would adjust the number of different species on an island, the rate of immigration. This is the idea that you have a mainland area that is a reservoir of new species who are trying to go everywhere. They're just going everywhere. And some of them make it to this hypothetical island. Well, the closer you are to the mainland, the more new species you'd get. The farther away from the mainland, the fewer new species. So here we've got rate of immigration. If you're closer to the mainland, you'd have a higher rate of new species coming in. Over here, we have the rate of extinction. So this is how fast are species going extinct. They would go extinct more slowly the larger the island. The larger the island, the more different microhabitats. The larger the island, the more diversity. So species would go extinct more slowly. So here we have how fast species are going extinct, and here is how fast are we getting new species. And the island that would have the most species would be a large island close to the mainland. So you're getting lots of new species and lots of them are surviving. Then the situation with the smallest number of species you'd expect would be far from the mainland, so not that many new arrivals, and it would have to be a small island with less diversity. Less diversity, fewer different organisms are going to be able to survive there. So the island with the fewest number of species, the lowest levels of biodiversity, would be far from the mainland and a small island. So it turns out there's a relationship between species richness and area, and it's logarithmic. That if you want to have twice as many species, you need to have 10 times the area. I'll say that again because it's super important. If you want to have twice as many species, you need to have 10 times the area. So if you had a park that held 10 species and you put a road in and you cut it in half, you don't have the same park. You now have two areas that are half the size. So if you had an organism that required the full area of that park as their habitat, like a large predator, like grizzly bears or mountain lions, for example, if they require that large habitat and you put a road down the middle of the park, that road acts as a barrier to dispersal and you no longer have that intact habitat. You now have two half-size habitats. So the number of species would drop dramatically. So it turns out you can't just have, it's not the total area of habitat, it's the unbroken area of habitat. So a whole bunch of little tiny islands don't add up to one large island. A whole bunch of little tiny islands equal a whole bunch of little tiny islands. So island biogeography has some incredibly powerful, incredibly important ideas. Soil. Soil's magic. Soil is the result of geology, the rocks that make it up, because that's what ultimately the nutrients in the soil are from, is the geology, the parent rocks. The shape, the geomorphology, the slopes, the aspect are going to affect how much moisture there is, how fast that soil is going to creep downhill and go someplace else or get blown away. Time, incredibly important, and climate, heat, and water. All these create unique types of soil. The U.S. Soil Classification System, there's an online soil web service site where you can click and find out exactly what kind of soils are underneath your feet, what their growing capacity is, what their fertility is, all kinds of amazing things. Here is a map of soils. I'm going to go over quickly some of the names that I think are important. I'm not going to test you on all of them. That would be ridiculous. But I think if I go over the names, it'll help things stick in your head a little bit more. And the names of the soils, thank goodness, many of them make sense. Oxisols, ox like oxygen, like oxidated, like it's rusted. These are old tropical solids. They've oxidized. Aridosols, arid means dry, so these are desert soils. Mollisols are the grassland soils. The root or the prefix mol means soft. Like if somebody's all freaking out, you're trying to calm them down, you're trying to mollify them. You're trying to soften their mood. So mollisols are very soft, very fertile, dark, rich soils. Ukraine, for example, has lots of these mollisols. The American plains have mollisols. Alphasols. Spodosols are pine trees, pine tree soils. Inseptisols are brand new, like they just got it started. They just got their inception. Gelisols are freezing periglacial soils. Andisols, not a whole lot of places have andisols. Hawaii has andisols. Those are volcanic soils named after the Andes, the volcanoes in the Andes, andisols. Vertisols are clay soils that develop those big vertical cracks. That's the vert part. Histosols, I figured out a way of remembering this. Histosols are soggy soils. Soggy. They're in these snowy forests on the border between, they're like subarctic soils where it's cold and wet. And so the ground is cold and wet and saturated. If you forgot to take an antihistamine, your nose would be running. So if your nose is all full of histamines cause your nose to get all congested and drippy. So these are gross, wet, drippy, cold, drippy nose soils, histosols. There are 5 pedogenic regimes. Ped refers to soil, genic, starting. So these are five ways that soil gets started. They are associated with specific climates, and those are laterization, making laterites, the tropical soils, calcification in arid soils, salinization, also in arid soils, podzolization refers to, I don't know what it refers to, podzels. Soils created in pine forests. The spodosols are result of podzolization, spodosols, podzolization, and gelization is going to be the kind of associated with like the similar conditions that make histosols. Like gelifluction is the Arctic equivalent of solifluction, which is when the ground gets saturated and oozes downhill. So gelization, they're Arctic, gross, wet, sloppy soils. Laterization is the pedogenic regime that leaches nutrients and makes oxysols, those rusted tropical soils. Calcification is when rainwater leaches calcium out of the top layer of the soil and then it accumulates in a lower layer. Salinization occurs in arid areas where the soil over time gets saltier, especially if there's irrigation. 94% of the cropland in Iran is subject to the problem of salinization because when you add water, you're adding water and minerals, and then the water evaporates, leaving behind just the minerals. So over time, the mineral content increases in the soil, and eventually plants can't grow. And that only happens in places where it's too dry, so you have to irrigate. The solution would be flooding the soil and then letting that water run off with all the nutrients, or minerals rather, but that's not going to happen because the climate is dry. Podzolization, the acidic pine needles with rainwater leach chemicals out. They disappear from the top layers of the soil and get deposited in the lower layers of the soil, making spodosols in those pine forests. Glazation makes gelisols, thick, wet, saturated gray layer of clay in cold, wet climates with poor drainage. Yuck. Pass. So we've got oxysols, the tropical climates. We've got mollisols, oxysols, tropical rainforest climates. Mollisols, grassland climates, great for growing grasses. Iridosols in the deserts, and alphasols in former forests. So they've got oxysols. They occur in tropical rainforests. They're well developed, heavily altered. They're reddish. We have oxysols in the foothills of the Sierra, that orange soil that stains your shoes, stains your car. That is an oxysol. It's an old weathered tropical soil from the Pleistocene era. Laterization is the leaching process that causes the soil to become this rocky material called laterite. Very poor in nutrients because they get washed away. So the nutrients are actually in the plants. So in the rainforest, the nutrients are in the plants. So when the plants get cut down, the nutrients get stolen. Water percolates through the ground, picks up iron and aluminum oxides, deposits them down in the lower layers of the soil. This is the process of laterization. And you can actually cut blocks of the soil, expose it to the air, and it dries into something resembling rock. The temple complex in Angkor Wat in Cambodia is made of blocks of soil that have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. The same thing happens in the Amazon. So when we see the images later of deforestation in the Amazon, when those soils are exposed to air and sunlight, they also bake into rock, except the difference there is the rainforest is getting cut down to grow grass for cattle to export for cheap hamburgers to the US. Iridosols, the largest soil order in the deserts, very poor, very shallow soil because, again, there's not enough water to get enough stuff growing to die to leave behind a lot of organic material. Some of the problems with iridosols, calcification and salinization. Calcification, as the water percolates through the ground, it picks up calcium. that gets deposited in a thick layer that can sometimes impede water. The calcium will actually bake into a layer called, or not bake, but develop a layer called caliche that'll actually act to slow the transfer of water as it percolates down through the ground. Mollisols, those soft, dark grassland soils. Soft soils. These soils of the steppes of Europe and the prairies of the United States. Very thick organic layers, incredibly fertile soils. Alpha soils, they used to be forests. They're fertile, whatever. Alpha soils. Across the American West, there is a spectrum going from the dry iridosols to the fertile mollisols to the slightly less fertile alpha soils. They're older forest soils. And the depth of accumulated line goes deeper with increasing precipitation. Good stuff. So we've got grassland soils, the mollisols, shallow soils and bunch grasses with the iridosols, and then the mollisols, and then we're into farmland and alpha soils as you go from west to east across the grasslands, the American prairies. Now we have some older soils. We have some new soils, antisols, old soils like the ultimate soil, spodosols. Those are those boreal pine needle forest soils, and inceptisols, they're just getting started. Altisols, highly weathered, reddish because of iron, respond well to good management. Here we've got growing peanuts in Plains, Georgia on an altisol. Spodosols in northern conifer means pine tree, so northern pine tree forests. They're formed off of sandy parent materials. So that could be glacial till, right? That ground up rock that's left over is going to become ultimately forest soils in America. And then over time, the interplay of the chemistry of the plants and the soil leads to more acidic conditions that leaches some materials in the process of podzolization. So podzolization is when the iron and aluminum oxides get leached out of the upper layers. So the upper layers of the soil are sandy or bleached in color. The iron and aluminum oxides get deposited in a layer deeper down in the soil. Entisols are not enough time. They just got started. Entisol, although that looks like an iridosol. But entisol, they're baby young soils. Inceptisols, next stage after entisols, lack maturity, whatever. Cold, volcanic, and organic. So we've got andisols, those are volcanic. Gelisols, those are the cold. Vertisols, those are clay. And histosols are soggy. Let's look at them soggy soils. Gelisols, cold. Frozen soils contain permafrost, high latitude, high elevation. Not a whole lot going on because the growing season is short. So I have no idea how to tell you what the difference is between a histosol and a gelisol in this case, because this sure as heck looks like a histosol to me, which is why I'm not going to ask you I'm not going to show you a picture and ask you to tell me, is it a histosol or a gelisol? But here we've got Arctic tundra, which could certainly develop a histosol or a gelisol. Andisol, volcanic soils, they're very fertile. Here we've got baby pineapples on I think the big island of Hawaii. Incredibly fertile. The only problem with living and growing in volcanic soils is you got to live by a volcano. So there's that. Vertisols, they get vertical cracks, lots of clay. So depositional environment back in the day as a low energy depositional environment to get clay to build up. And then when it dries out, you get big cracks. Histosols, organic soils, former lake beds or small, poorly drained depressions. They're saturated or flooded. They're wetlands. This is a peat bog, and they actually dry this out in places like Ireland and burn it for fuel in a stove. So here we've got sphagnum moss becoming peat. And now we've got biomes. And I would hope that you look at this and think, well, the colors are different, but it sure as heck looks like the climate map with rainforest, desert, savanna and steppe, more rainforest, humid subtropical, humid continental, subarctic climates, Mediterranean, hot desert, steppe, Mediterranean, and then tundra. So let's look through the terrestrial biomes. And again, I'm going to put out a big plug to the Planet Earth and Our Earth, the BBC series, the nature documentaries. They're pretty much talking about these biomes. Planet Earth, much more so, because they would focus on tropical rainforest or boreal forests or mixed broadleaf forest. All those different biomes got tackled episode by episode. So if you've been enjoying those, continue to enjoy them. Also now enjoy them more knowing that what you're looking at are terrestrial biomes. Slightly zoomed in for your viewing pleasure, but it's the figure out of the book. Here is the World Wildlife Foundation's. So we've got tropical rainforest, we've got desert, we've got Mediterranean, we've got broadleaf forest. We've got temperate rainforest in the marine west coast climate sometimes. So we're going to tackle those 10 basic biomes, but we're going to tackle them based on latitude for starters. So we're going to start in the tropics and look at the different things that I'm going to back up because it just occurred to me. One way of approaching the organization of biomes is to look at them based on the vegetation growth form. So to do it that way, we would look at, for example, boreal forest, the snowy pine tree forest, and then we'd look at mixed broadleaf forest. We'd look at temperate rainforest, and we'd look at tropical rainforest. So we'd look at all the different forests across the different climates, but we're looking at this one growth pattern. And then we'd look at the grasslands. We'd look at short grassland, long grassland. So one way of looking at biomes and organizing them is based on the vegetation. And another way would be to look at lumping them into similar latitudinal or climatic zones. So that's the way I'm going to do it, is based on, we're going to start in the tropics. So we'll look at rainforest to desert in the tropics, and then we'll look at the mid-latitudes, and we'll look at the different biomes in the mid-latitudes. So in the tropics, we've got tropical rainforest. It's warm every single day. Oxisols are the soil associated with the tropical rainforests. The tropical rainforests are all in the tropics. Huge biomass, some of the highest productivity in the world found in tropical rainforests because they get 12 hours of light, because they get enough water every day. Competition for light at this forest floor is huge, but the tropical rainforest has lots of vertical zonation with some organisms that like to live up in the top where it's light. There's lots of light, lots of wind, less rain. Other organisms like the very dark, sheltered conditions down at the bottom of the rainforest. Many tropical rainforests have what's called a triple canopy of an understory of low trees, the middle canopy, and then an overstory of huge 200-foot tall trees that pop up above the middle canopy. The overstory, the middle canopy, and the understory. And then often the forest floor is very open because there is so little light. Not a lot of plants can grow in the forest floor. A lot of our house plants are tropical rainforest forest floor plants because our homes inside, it doesn't look dark to us, but if you're a plant, our homes look pretty dark. So the same kind of environment that's good for houseplants is, well, our houseplants are tropical rainforest forest floor plants. Often the roots are buttressed to provide support so the trees don't fall over. Snake. Deforestation, clearing the tropics is the biggest hazard to the tropics. Massive deforestation. I think I've got some videos in the playlist of looking at satellite imagery, and we can actually quantify exactly how much of the rainforest is disappearing. So in the context of island biogeography, that was the habitat, and now we have fragmented, scattered bits of habitat. examples of aerial imagery looking at the deforestation, including government activities like putting more highways that increase the access to the rainforest for settlers to go and clear the land forest and grow food, as well as loggers. Okay, next up, tropical seasonal forest and scrub, lower rainfall. The ITCZ isn't overhead all year, so we're talking monsoonal to savanna conditions. Monsoon to savanna. So still in the tropics, but getting closer to the subtropics. Trees and grass, koalas. Tropical savanna, large expanses of grassland. We're talking about savanna. Now we're talking about Lion King, more grass, less tree. It's the going from tropical rainforest to the drier tropical seasonal forest and scrub. So it's a forest, so there's enough rain year round to have a forest, but it's not a tropical rainforest. On the other hand, there's way more rain than if we were in a tropical savanna. Tropical savanna, now we're talking Lion King, grassland with trees, fire adapted, grassland. Yeah, that's a great shot. Grassland with scattered animals, with scattered trees, with fire. Mid-latitudes. So now we've gotten through the tropical rainforest, tropical seasonal scrub, tropical savanna. Now we're in the mid-latitudes. We have broadleaf and mixed forest. This is most of the East Coast. Altisols, alpha sols, cool to cold winters. So that would be your humid subtropical into humid continental climates. Mid-latitudes, like I said, a lot of the East Coast, a lot of Europe is mid-latitude broadleaf and mixed forest. This deciduous forest and needle leaf trees, some of them are going to drop their leaves, some of them are not. There you go. Mid-latitude flying squirrel. And now we're getting colder. Boreal and montane. Montane refers to mountain. Northern needle leaf forest. Now we're into the snowy forest climate. Now we're into the freezing winters with a summertime. Because of the pine trees, we're developing spotosols from the process of podzolization. So we're going higher in latitude, higher in elevation. So here high elevation, here high elevation, high elevation, high elevation, high latitude. The boreal and montane snowy forest. Perfect. You got snow, you got forest. It's a snowy forest. It's been clear cut for toilet paper because capitalism. Temperate rainforest. This is going to be in the marine west coast, the CFA or CFB. Marine west coast is a CFB climate under the Köppen climate classification system. The marine west coast, temperate rainforest. It doesn't freeze. It rains year round. Some of the tallest trees in the world. Coastal redwoods live here. Incredibly diverse forests, incredibly high biomass. Although in these forests, the biomass and the living biomass in a dead tree can actually be more than the living biomass in a living tree. The mass of living cells as a result of fungi breaking down one of these old growth trees, there's going to be more living material in a dead tree than in a living redwood tree. Mid-latitude, so now we're drier, Mediterranean shrubland, that's where we live, temperate regions, dry summers, which means you got to be west coast, cold current, subtropical high combo for that. Woody shrubs, grassy woodlands. So we're in the subtropics, we're subjected to the subtropical high, subtropical high, subtropical high, subtropical high. Chaparral in Southern California, although, and here's one of the fun things, different biomes in different places look the same. So Mediterranean shrubland looks the same all over the world. Because of the physical adaptations to that climate, the plants look similar. You can find Mediterranean plants all over the world. And if you're a botanist, you'd look at it and go, oh, hard, waxy leaves to restrict water loss and also to help you burn. You've got to be living in a chaparral forest someplace. Just like those huge, freaky tropical leaves. Nobody would look at those and go, oh, yeah, boreal forest. Nobody would look at that and go, oh, desert. Those huge, soft, fleshy leaves with all that surface area to lose water. There's no way that's going to be in a desert. That's going to be... So Mediterranean shrubland looks the same all over the world. Here we've got Southern California, coastal sage scrub. Here we've got after the fire. So these, they might be dead. They might just not have bounced back. But in the infographics that I've added for these slides, I included some that include like the large burls that store energy. So after the fire, the plant has enough stored energy to resprout and regrow. These are cork oaks. Every 7 years, you can peel off the outer bark and make it into cork for bottles or bulletin boards or whatever. Cork is a totally renewable resource. Unfortunately, globally, demand for cork has plummeted because of screw-on bottle caps for wine. The wine industry likes the screw-on bottle caps because they work better and they're cheaper, and they actually keep the wine fresh longer, which I think is funny. But this practice goes worldwide. The cork oaks in the too long didn't read slides, I threw in some pictures of Corsica, and it looks exactly like this because Mediterranean climates produce plants that look the same. Just like desert plants all over the world, they're going to look the same. So we're still in the mid-latitudes. Now we're talking about mid-latitude grasslands. Mid-latitude grasslands are the most modified biome. We use it for agriculture. We use it for our cities. We have converted most of the grassland over for human use. Mollisols, lots of mollisols. Few trees because it's too dry for trees. Deserts cover more than a third of the land area. We've got warm deserts and steppe and cold deserts and steppe. So we've got grasslands of short and long grass, and then hot deserts and steppes, cold deserts. Yeah, where's the cold desert? Cold desert, cold desert, cold desert. Yeah. The bison on the American plains, incredibly well adapted to life on the prairies. Snow in the wintertime, scorching heat in the summer. They don't care. Desert plant adaptations, often thick, fleshy tissues like cactus. Cactus! You know, if you see a cactus, there's no doubt in your mind what the climate's like where that grows because of the way they look. You just go, oh yeah, that's a cactus that grows in a desert. Well, thick fleshy tissues mean that they can store water for the long dry season. Long taproots mean that when it rains, they can get as much water as possible. Shallow spreading root systems also allow them to soak up water when it rains. And they'll even include chemicals to prevent other plants from growing by them. They will actually create poison. Some desert plants will produce chemicals that are poisonous to other plants so that their shallow root systems won't get competition from other species of plants. Small leaves, waxy leaf coatings, leaf drop during dry periods, these are all desert plant adaptations. Here is a diagram including leaf drop during dry periods for ocotillo, waxy coatings on the creosote bush, long taproots on the mesquite trees, tiny leaves on the acacia, thick fleshy tissue to store water. So I hadn't put this together, somebody else told me, but saguaros don't live in places where it freezes in the winter because they would burst. And I thought, oh yeah, duh, I just never put two and two together, that water expands 9% when it freezes. So if you're a cactus and you're mostly water, you're going to expand 9% and burst and die if it freezes. So you don't find saguaros in areas where the temperatures get below freezing. So some typical desert plant adaptations. There's a lovely saguaro, some opuntia. Oh, and ocotillos. Delightful. Arctic and alpine tundra. So colder than boreal forest. It's so cold that you don't get trees. And the cold is either because you're high in latitude or you're high in elevation. Arctic tundra, high in latitude. Alpine tundra, high in elevation. Like the Alps. Get it? Winters are long and awful. Long days in the summer, but a very short growing season in the summer, but long days during the summer. So grow your butt off in the summertime and then hunker down for the winter. So again, you'd find this at high elevation, like Mount Chimborazo right on the equator, high latitude, high latitude, high elevation, high elevation. Well, actually, high elevation, high latitude. Nature's complex. So here we've got some Arctic tundra, some mosses. Reindeer would eat that. Some lichen, reindeer would eat that, but no trees because it's just too cold. This is it. This is this year's crop of moss and lichen. So even and these are going to grow for years and years and years before they die. In fact, lichen often grows for centuries, and so we can get long-term environmental records off of lichen because it grows so slowly. I mean, it's going to be in the dark for like 4 months, and it's going to be frozen 24/7 for like another 2 months, and then the sun comes out, and you're going to grow slowly, and then you go dormant. So they're not fast organisms. So very thin, very fragile soils in tundra. Here we've got goats. It's going to make a crave that mineral joke, but it's just not worth it. Anthropogenic biomes are biomes that have been altered by humans, which is pretty much everything. Humans, we've cleared off habitat to make room for agriculture, forestry, cities, all those things. Cattle ranch on the big island of Hawaii, rainforest cleared for agriculture in Brazil. Humans have modified much of the planet, if not the entire planet. And that's it. I hope you enjoy this video. I hope you enjoy the chapter. I hope that you have hours of spare time to watch the other videos in the playlist for chapter 13 and 14. They are, I think, some of the best and some of the best at wrapping everything up in a nice little neat package, going all the way from, like I said, talking in chapter 1 about latitude being the most important, and if it's not latitude, it's continentality because of plate tectonics or altitude. And the distribution of biomes is because of latitude as affected by high elevation or interior locations. So I wish you good luck on your final exam. If you have questions, please come to Zoom and ask me questions.